Millionaire CEO James Hartwell finds Charlotte, his housekeeper, collapsed in the hospital corridors where she works part-time. "Is she pregnant?" he asks the doctor in shock, carrying her in his arms as if she were the most precious person in the world. But when he discovers the truth about this woman who cleans his Kensington mansion every morning at 5 a.m., everything he thought he knew about life, love, and himself will be destroyed forever. The final revelation will change both their destinies in an incredible way. The sterile corridors of St. Bartholomew's Hospital echoed with the constant murmur of doctors and nurses moving beneath the fluorescent lights. The penetrating smell of disinfectant mingled with the palpable anxiety of those waiting for news, fighting between life and death, hoping for a miracle that might never come. James Hartwell traversed these corridors with the assured step of a man accustomed to dominating every situation. His navy Savile Row suit contrasted sharply with the hospital environment, but he seemed oblivious to it. At 42, he had transformed Hartwell Pharmaceuticals into a half-billion-pound pharmaceutical empire, specializing in experimental cancer drugs. Since losing his wife Victoria 3 years earlier, hospitals had become his personal battlefield against disease, not from love of humanity, but from cold, calculated revenge against the fate that had torn away the only love of his life. He was leaving the boardroom after signing a $500 million contract with the hospital trust when he saw her. Charlotte Evans, 28, was slumped against the corridor wall like a broken doll. Her face pale as paper, eyes closed, the cleaning trolley overturned beside her in a disorder that told of the violence of her collapse. James recognized her immediately. She was the housekeeper who worked in his Kensington mansion every morning early. Always discreet, always silent, always with that kind smile when their eyes met by chance, whilst he drank coffee before going to the office. Her chestnut hair had escaped from its neat ponytail, and the blue hospital uniform was stained with cold sweat. Instinct overwhelmed reason. James dropped his leather briefcase and ran to her, shouting for help. 2 nurses rushed over immediately, whilst he knelt beside Charlotte, gently taking her pulse. The beat was weak, but regular, like an injured bird struggling to survive. When Charlotte slowly opened her eyes, 2 green pools looked at him with confusion and shame. She tried to get up, murmuring apologies for the disturbance and insisting she had to finish her shift. But James, for the first time in 3 years, felt something stir in his frozen chest. The doctor came running, and after a quick examination decided on immediate transfer to A&E. James didn't hesitate for a second. He took her in his arms as if she weighed nothing, feeling the fragility of her body against his chest. During the journey to A&E, Charlotte whispered confused apologies, wondering why such an important man was caring for a simple housekeeper. James's response surprised her as much as it surprised him. With a tenderness he hadn't felt for years, he told her she wasn't anything simple. She was something special, even though neither of them understood what yet. In A&E, James waited as if he were family. The nurses, recognizing the powerful CEO, didn't dare question his presence. But he wasn't there for power or influence. He was there because, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt he needed to protect this fragile woman, who had shattered his certainties. When the doctor emerged from the examination room, James's face was taut as a violin string. The question he asked the doctor, whether Charlotte was pregnant, came naturally, as if he had the right to worry about her. The answer he received would change everything he thought he knew about life. Dr. Thompson observed James with an expression that mixed medical professionalism with deep human concern. The diagnosis he pronounced made the world collapse beneath the CEO's feet. Charlotte wasn't pregnant, but suffered from severe anemia and chronic malnutrition caused by a lifestyle that bordered on self-destruction. The truth emerged in pieces, like a terrible puzzle assembling before James's incredulous eyes. Charlotte worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. 3 different shifts that followed seamlessly. Cleaning James's mansion from 5 to 8 in the morning, cleaning at the hospital from 9 to 4, and night shift at a factory on the outskirts of London from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Her body had simply given way under the weight of inhuman exhaustion. But the real shock came when James managed to speak with Charlotte in the hospital room. Sitting beside her bed, looking at that pale but determined face, he discovered the reason behind this self-destructive devotion. Charlotte had a younger sister, Emma, aged 16. Their parents had died in a car accident when Emma was 10, and since then, Charlotte was all the girl had in the world. Charlotte's account was interrupted by emotion-laden pauses. Emma was brilliant, excellent at school, dreamed of becoming a doctor. But private schools cost money, books cost money, everything cost money. Charlotte had sacrificed her youth, her health, her life to guarantee her sister the opportunities she'd never had. When James asked about her personal dreams, Charlotte's answer was devastatingly simple. Her dreams coincided entirely with Emma's future. She had no ambitions for herself, no personal desires. She had transformed sisterly love into a life mission that was literally killing her. This revelation struck James like a direct punch to the heart. He found himself facing a form of love he'd forgotten existed, pure, selfless love that asked nothing in return and gave itself completely. It was the exact opposite of his life, built on success, power, and revenge against fate. Whilst he watched Charlotte speak of her sister with eyes that lit up despite her fatigue, James became aware of an uncomfortable truth. In 3 years, he had never stopped to really look at this woman who cleaned his house. He had treated her like a ghost, a silent and invisible presence in his world of luxury. This woman cleaned his house every morning at 5 a.m., arranged his most intimate spaces, cared for his domestic environment with a devotion he had always taken for granted. He had treated her like a ghost, a silent and invisible presence in his world of luxury. That evening, he promised Charlotte that things would change, looking at her with an intensity she had never seen in those 3 years of silent mornings in his mansion. He didn't yet know how or why, but he felt deep within that this fragile woman between the hospital sheets was about to revolutionize his existence. What he didn't imagine was that the truth about Charlotte was far more complex than it appeared. And when he discovered it, his world would collapse completely, only to be reborn in a form he had never dared dream. 2 days after Charlotte's collapse, James couldn't get the image of this fragile woman unconscious in his arms out of his mind. He had cancelled all his important appointments and spent his time doing something he hadn't done for years, investigating someone's life, not for calculation or advantage, but out of pure human curiosity. What he discovered completely shocked him. The database at the London School of Economics revealed an incredible truth. Charlotte Evans wasn't just a housekeeper. She had graduated in economics with first-class honors and obtained a master's in international finance just 2 years ago, concluding with a brilliant dissertation on pharmaceutical investments that had impressed the entire faculty. The discovery was like receiving a punch to the stomach. James stared at the computer screen in his office, unable to believe what he was seeing. How was it possible that such a brilliant mind found herself cleaning floors instead of running companies? The call to human resources revealed an even more devastating truth. Michael, visibly uncomfortable, handed him a file containing the application Charlotte had submitted 2 years earlier for a financial analyst position at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals. The qualifications were excellent, perhaps the best they had ever seen. The cover letter was a masterpiece of professional passion mixed with human necessity. Charlotte wrote about her sister, the financial difficulties, how much she needed this opportunity to change their lives. Yet, she had been rejected. The name on the evaluation report froze the blood in James's veins. Richard Sterling, his deputy CEO, the man he had blindly trusted for 5 years. According to the report, the candidate lacked the necessary experience for such an important position, a justification that seemed ridiculous considering her qualifications superior to many analysts hired in the same period. When Richard entered James's office, his confident smile immediately vanished upon seeing the CEO's expression. The man he had considered a trusted friend transformed before his eyes into a stranger when he confessed the truth. He had sabotaged Charlotte's application for fear that James would realize she could do his job better than him. Richard had destroyed a brilliant woman's life to protect his corporate position. He had condemned Charlotte to 2 years of inhuman labor, prevented Emma from having the opportunities she deserved, shattered 2 sisters' dreams for his petty selfishness. Richard's dismissal was immediate and final. James couldn't even look at him as he left the office, taking with him 5 years of false friendship and hidden betrayals. That evening, instead of returning to his luxury penthouse, James waited in the offices. He wanted to see Charlotte, speak to her, ask forgiveness for an injustice for which he was indirectly responsible. When she arrived for her evening shift and found him sitting at the desk, the terror in her eyes broke his heart. Charlotte thought she had done something wrong, apologized for the trouble caused at A&E, feared losing the only job that allowed her to support Emma. Her fear of being sacked was so palpable that James felt the weight of all his privileges crushing him like a mountain. That's when he made the most important decision of his life: to tell Charlotte the whole truth and offer her what had been unjustly denied 2 years earlier. James's office, lit only by the desk lamp, resembled a confessional in the twilight of the London evening. Charlotte stood motionless near the door, nervously clutching the cleaning cloth in her hands, like a little bird ready to flee at the first sudden movement. James opened the file on the desk and began to tell a truth that would forever change their lives. His voice came out heavy and charged with emotion as he explained how Richard had sabotaged her application, how her qualifications had been ignored through fear and envy, how for 2 years she had cleaned these offices when she should have been directing them. Charlotte's face transformed during the account. First disbelief, then understanding, finally a deep pain that mixed with anger. 2 years of inhuman labor. 2 years when she had felt inadequate. 2 years when Emma had seen her return home destroyed every evening, wondering why her sister couldn't find a better job. Charlotte's most painful confession concerned her nights. After cleaning James's mansion from 5 to 8 in the morning, she rushed to the hospital for the day shift. Then, in the evening, worked at a factory. Between jobs, she continued studying, read specialist magazines, kept herself updated, hoping that sooner or later someone would give her a chance.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
James felt the weight of his indirect responsibility crushing his chest. He offered Charlotte the position of financial director that Richard had left vacant, but her reaction surprised him. She didn't want to accept a job out of pity or guilt. She wanted to be sure the offer was based on merit, not compassion. James's response was direct and sincere. He wasn't offering it out of pity, but because she was the most courageous, determined, and intelligent person he had ever met. Because his company needed someone like her. But there was something else in James's confession. Something that went beyond work and professional justice. With a vulnerability he hadn't shown for years, he admitted that Charlotte had awakened something in him that he believed had died with his wife Victoria. When he had taken her in his arms in the hospital corridors, For the first time in 3 years, he had felt his heart truly beat. Charlotte looked into his eyes, trying to understand if he was sincere or simply trying to repair a mistake from the past. Her question was direct. What would happen between them if she accepted? She was still the housekeeper he had seen faint. He was still the millionaire CEO who had never noticed her before. James's answer was brutally honest. She was right. He had never noticed her before. But now that he had, he couldn't go back. He didn't want to go back. He gently took Charlotte's hands in his, feeling the roughness of her fingers caused by years of humble work. He told her to take time to decide, but promised that whatever she chose, he would be there, as boss, as friend, or as something deeper and more meaningful. What neither of them knew was that Richard, furious about the dismissal and burned by humiliation, was already planning a revenge that would endanger everything they were building. A week later, Charlotte's transformation had been radical and surprising. From the first day as financial director, she had demonstrated intelligence and competence that exceeded James's most optimistic expectations. In a few days, she had identified inefficiencies that Richard had ignored for years, proposed innovative investment strategies, and won the respect of the entire leadership team. Emma, her sister, couldn't believe her eyes when Charlotte had explained what had happened. For the first time in years, they had been able to afford dinner at a restaurant to celebrate, and Emma had seen her sister smile with a serenity she hadn't shown since their parents died. In the offices of Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, Charlotte and James often worked late, discussing projects and sharing visions about the company's future. But beyond work, something deeper and unexpected was being born. In their glances, there was a mutual understanding that went beyond words, a connection that both felt but neither dared yet name. James began telling her about Victoria, his deceased wife, about the love they had shared, and how she had always believed in justice and opportunities for everyone. Charlotte listened with an emotional participation that had nothing to do with professional politeness. One afternoon, whilst they were reviewing the accounts together, their eyes met across the desk. For a moment, the outside world disappeared, and both felt that something special was happening between them, something that went beyond guilt and gratitude. But that same evening, as Charlotte left the office, she was approached in the underground car park by a figure that made her shudder. Richard Sterling emerged from the shadows with a threatening expression that transformed his face into a mask of resentment. His words were like dagger thrusts. He accused her of seducing James to get the promotion, of going from cleaning toilets to running his company by using feminine wiles instead of competence. The contempt in his voice was palpable, mixed with a rage that went beyond reason. But the real threat came when Richard pulled out a folder from his bag. The documents it contained, according to him, would destroy James's reputation and the entire company. He spoke of experimental drugs with hidden side effects, deaths linked to Hartwell products, cover-ups, and blood-stained profits. Richard's ultimatum was simple and cruel. If Charlotte didn't immediately leave her position and return to cleaning, these documents would end up in the newspapers the next day. James would end up in prison, the company would collapse, and everything they had built would turn to ashes. Charlotte took the folder with trembling hands, feeling the weight of a responsibility she had never asked for. Richard left, leaving her alone in the dark car park, with documents that seemed to burn between her fingers. That night, she didn't sleep a wink. She studied every page, every chart, every detail of these documents that seemed detailed, precise, terrifyingly credible. What if it was all true? What if James was really hiding something so serious? What if the man she was falling in love with was a criminal who put profit before human life? The next day, when James found her in the office with dark circles and a devastated expression, He immediately understood that something terrible had happened. The conversation that followed would test everything they had built together. James's office transformed into a silent courtroom as Charlotte pushed Richard's documents towards him. Her hands trembled slightly, and her green eyes were full of suffering that broke James's heart. The account of the meeting with Richard came out with difficulty from Charlotte's lips. Every word was charged with pain and betrayal, as if she were confessing to having discovered that everything she believed in was a lie. Richard had threatened her. Either she returned to cleaning, or these documents would end up in the newspapers. James took the papers and began reading them in silence. His face darkened with each page, and the silence that filled the room was the longest in Charlotte's life. When he finally looked up, his response was like lightning. It was all true. Charlotte's world collapsed at that moment. The man she was falling in love with, the man she had believed different from all others, admitted to hiding deaths linked to his experimental drugs. She jumped up, feeling betrayed and disgusted, ready to flee from what now seemed like a murderer's office. But James stopped her with a desperation that went beyond words. The documents were true, but they didn't tell the whole story. The truth was much more complex and painful than Richard had wanted her to believe. With a voice broken by emotion, James began telling the story he had kept buried for 3 years. Victoria hadn't died from natural breast cancer. Victoria had died because she had wanted to test on herself the experimental drug he was developing to cure her tumor. The words came out with difficulty from James's throat, as if each syllable caused him physical pain. The drug was promising, but not yet ready for human trials. Victoria knew this, but she was desperate, and he, blinded by love and desperation, had let her do it. The result had been devastating. The drug had not only failed to cure her, but had accelerated the tumor's progression. Victoria had died in 3 weeks instead of 3 months, and James carried the weight of having killed her with his own hands. Every drug he had developed since, every test he authorized, every decision he made was conditioned by the terror of killing again someone he loved. Richard knew this truth and was using it to destroy him, presenting the facts as if James was hiding deaths for profit, instead of from a guilt that devoured him every day. The explanation about patients who died during experimentation revealed a reality very different from that painted by Richard. Every death was recorded according to the strictest protocols. Every family had been informed of the risks. Every procedure had been followed to the letter. But Richard presented these facts as criminal cover-up. Charlotte listened in silence, finally seeing the man behind the facade of the successful CEO. A man tormented by guilt, who had transformed his pain into a mission to save others, who lived every day with the fear of repeating the mistake that had killed his wife. James's question, why he hadn't told her earlier, revealed his deepest vulnerability. He had been afraid that if Charlotte had known the truth, she would have looked at him as he looked at himself every morning in the mirror, as a murderer who had killed the person he loved most. But Charlotte's response overwhelmed all his expectations. She approached him and looked into his eyes with a determination that admitted no doubt. He wasn't a murderer. He was a man who had made a mistake out of love and now dedicated his life to not repeating it. Charlotte had seen how he treated his employees, had studied the safety protocols he had implemented, had observed how much he cared about every single patient who used his drugs. A murderer wouldn't have done all this. The words that followed came from Charlotte's heart before her mind could stop them. She loved him. She loved him for his vulnerability, for the guilt that made him human, for how he had saved her and Emma from poverty. And she loved him for how he honored Victoria's memory by trying to save others. The kiss they shared was charged with the desperation of someone who had thought they'd lost everything and instead found a second chance at love. When they separated, James was a different man, no longer crushed by guilt, but freed by understanding and forgiveness. The decision about Richard was immediate. He could publish those documents if he wanted. The truth was the truth, and James had nothing left to hide or be ashamed of. A month later, Richard had indeed published the documents in the newspapers, but instead of the scandal he hoped to create, he had triggered a wave of support for James from patients and families who had benefited from his drugs. His transparency about experimental risks was seen as an example of medical ethics, not negligence. Charlotte and James married 6 months later, in a simple but moving ceremony attended by Emma, who was finally able to enroll at medical school thanks to a scholarship established by the Victoria Hartwell Foundation. During their honeymoon, watching the sunset over the Cotswolds, Charlotte confided to James her conviction that Victoria had approved of everything that had happened. She had chosen a man who never gave up in the fight to save lives and somehow had brought them together at the right moment. James kissed her tenderly, realizing that his wife had taught him a fundamental lesson. Sometimes the most beautiful life begins exactly when you think everything is over. And sometimes the greatest love is born from the ability to forgive oneself and others. Has this story touched your heart? Has it made you believe that true love can be born from mutual understanding, forgiveness, and the ability to see beyond appearances? If you too believe that second chances exist, that a person's worth doesn't depend on their job, but on their character, and that true love knows how to look beyond past mistakes to build a better future. Give it a like and share this video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever judged someone too quickly? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance? Do you know stories of people who found love just when they least expected it? Share your experiences, and let's get this message of hope and forgiveness to as many people as possible. Because sometimes the deepest love is born from understanding others' pain, and the greatest happiness is found when we learn to love ourselves despite our mistakes. Subscribe for more stories that prove love and forgiveness can truly change everything. Like, comment, share, and subscribe for stories that celebrate the power of redemption and authentic love.